They laughed at my hands, the same hands that signed their mortgage and once sewed their Halloween costumes out of pillowcases. And I smiled like a woman who didn't feel it, like a woman made of cork instead of skin. I am 82, and I live alone, now in a small apartment that looks west over a parking lot and a thin strip of maple trees that turn the color of rusted pennies in October. There is a kettle that sings when it is ready, a chair that knows the shape of my back, and a narrow table where I write these words with the very hands that embarrassed them at dinner. The same hands they wanted hidden in my lap beneath a linen napkin, while the waiter placed the bill delicately in their name, as if generosity had a surname, and mine wasn't. Good enough. I was supposed to feel cherished that night, to be dazzled by the candles and the frosted syllables of a dessert menu none of us could pronounce, to bask in the arranged performance of family. But what I remember is the way my daughter tilted her head toward my fingers when I reached for the bread and said, almost sweetly, that perhaps I should save room for cake, and then the little ripple of laughter that gathered around the table like gnats over a summer bowl of fruit, and then the son-in-law's quip, something about a manicure shaped like topiary, that at least they could trim the old branches, followed by my granddaughter's nervous giggle, which hurt more than any joke because it sounded like a key being turned from the other side of a door. I had come in my good dress, the one I pressed in careful sweeps with the iron that morning, and I had rubbed lotion into my knuckles until the skin shone. And I had told myself to sit up straight, to listen more than speak, to let the evening sail on a quiet tide, because my daughter had said this was a celebration and that she wanted to make a fuss over me for once, and I had chosen to believe her, or to pretend belief, which is almost the same thing when you are a mother who has practiced hope so long it can be hung from your shoulders like a shawl. The waiter was young, kind-eyed, and quick with the water, and when the plates cleared, he set down a small saucer of chocolates between us as if to broker a peace I was not yet willing to admit we needed. Then he returned with the leather folder, laid it before my daughter with a discreet nod, and said, "Thank you for dining with us, Dr. and Mrs. Flores," a title that fit them like a rented suit, shiny and proud. And in that moment, I understood how complete the erasure was meant to be. Even language had chosen its side. Even the bill knew whose names mattered, and my hands, which had spent a life paying before asking, were suddenly strangers to the rituals of gratitude. They kept glancing down at them, those hands, as if the knots and ridges were badges of bad manners instead of a map of decades, and I made a joke about arthritis to soften the air, as women do when they are asked to disappear politely. I said something about how the weather predicts me now, how rain lives in my ring finger, and everyone laughed in the right way, relieved to have an exit back to comfort. And I chewed the last corner of my steak until it tasted like wool, and told myself to remember the good parts, the candlelight, the warmth of soup, the way the salmon flaked under the side of a fork, and not the moment when my granddaughter, graceful and bright, studied my wrist like a specimen and asked if I had ever thought of paraffin baths because TikTok said they work miracles. I wanted to tell her, these hands have already met their miracle 100 times over, that they have pulled babies wet and furious into the light, have buttoned jackets on reluctant toddlers, have scrubbed bathrooms at midnight before company came. The next day, have signed papers that kept roofs from leaking and men from leaving, have held a husband's cooling shoulder while the machines clicked down to zero and the room dared me to speak God's name. I wanted to say that my hands are a book she hasn't learned to read all index and glossary and thumbing pages at the corners where the best parts live. But I said none of that, because to explain dignity is to lose it in front of people who still think your worth is an opinion that can be debated over sorbet. After dinner, my daughter kissed my cheek with that soft, managerial affection that smells faintly of citrus and hurry. And in the car, she talked about a fundraiser next month and whether I might be up to watching the kids for an afternoon if they arranged everything carefully so I wouldn't overextend. And I said we would see, which is mother speak for I will do what is asked. And then I came home to my apartment that is small enough for one woman to carry like a bowl, and I set my purse on the table and wondered how long it would take the sting to become a story instead of a bruise. A woman of my age should be practiced at these transitions, the way the body learns to rise slow from chairs, the way the mouth learns to chew quietly and say thank you even as the meal goes sideways. And yet I stood by the sink with my coat still on and felt like a schoolgirl left behind after the bell, dust motes floating in the kitchen light, like tiny witnesses that would not testify. I made tea the way I do now, 2 bags because I like it stubborn, and I held the mug with both hands and studied them as if they belonged to another, noticing the crescent scars from a summer of canning peaches in the 70s, the soft swell where I broke a finger catching a falling casserole dish at Thanksgiving, the quilt of thin lines from years of needle and thread, and I thought of how each mark had been a choice to keep living in a way no one celebrates because it has no anthem, only repetition, and perhaps that is what offended them most about my hands, not their age, but their memory. The proof of a life spent in service to everything they believe happens naturally when you want it enough. The truth is, I don't know when kindness became a performance and gratitude a photo opportunity, but I know the exact hour I decided to stop auditioning for either, and it began when a waiter looked at a table and guessed, correctly, who would sign their name to the night. You should know who I am before you decide whether to believe the rest. I am the woman who stayed after the hurricanes and swept muck from the church basement because the deacons were too old and the young men too busy. I am the nurse's aide who did not flinch when a patient asked for a hand to hold during the dark part, between morphine and whatever comes next. I am the mother who gave away her emerald ring to make a tuition payment because my daughter cried in a dorm hallway and said, very small, that she didn't want to be the girl who left mid-semester. I am the widow who learned to sleep without the small thunder of another breath and who still sometimes puts out 2 plates by mistake and then eats from both so the food won't look bereft. I am the grandmother who buys theater tickets in the balcony and tells everyone the view is better from above even when the stairs insist otherwise. And I am, despite all the subtraction the years have attempted, someone's child still, the daughter of a seamstress who taught me that hands are the only prayer that never goes unanswered, because even when God is silent, a hand can lift, carry, soothe, and mend. If I sound proud, forgive me. It is new, this particular muscle, and it aches when I use it, but pride is lighter than shame and better for the spine. I do not know why the world believes old women should have none, why we are expected to fold ourselves neatly at the edges of people's lives like extra napkins in a drawer and only be taken out when things get messy, why our hands must be smooth, enough for Instagram before they are allowed to touch the living. Perhaps that is why I am writing, to choose a different ending than the one that was handed to me with the bill I did not receive. Perhaps I want to set my hands down on this page and say, here, look, They are not pretty, but they are true. And if beauty cannot find a place for truth at the table, then I will find another table with a pot of soup that is cooked all day and a chair that does not mind my weight. I tell you this from my apartment, with its hum of the refrigerator like an old friend clearing his throat, with its view that is not much by any measure, but belongs to me every evening when the sky learns the color of plums, with its quiet that is not loneliness but permission. The night after the dinner, I took off my shoes and rubbed the aches from my arches the way my mother used to do, pressing circles as if the past could be kneaded into a softer shape. And then I opened the small tin on the bookshelf that holds the few extravagances I allow, a reel of blue thread for the hems that come loose, a brass thimble that belonged to my mother, a square of lavender soap wrapped in paper, and I held the thimble in my palm like a relic, remembering the weight of her hand over mine when she taught me to push a needle cleanly through stubborn cloth, to breathe when the thready snarl came at the eye, to never fear the tiny pricks that draw a dot of blood because they are a tuition paid to learn how to hold things together. That, I realized, is what I have been doing all my life and what my hands were mocked for at dinner, holding things together that other people wanted to pretend came that way, stitching without applause, signing without credit, serving without the ceremony that makes kindness edible to those who must swallow it with their pride intact. If that sounds bitter, it is only because the tea has cooled. Warm, it was gentler, and tomorrow I will make it again, and the day after that, until my hands decide they have told the story enough times that even the ones who laughed will hear it in their sleep and wake, perhaps, with the urge to call their mothers and say nothing except, "I see you, I see you, I see you." The morning after that dinner, I woke up before the sun had finished, deciding whether it wanted to show its face. I sat on the edge of my bed, the sheet creased around my knees, and stared at my hands resting in my lap. They looked calmer in the pale light, almost apologetic, as if they too were embarrassed by what had happened. But I knew that wasn't true. Hands don't apologize. They just tell the truth you try to hide. I made coffee in the small percolator I've had for 20 years, and while it hissed and burbled like an old friend clearing its throat, I found myself replaying every moment of the dinner, the laughter, the sideways glances, the way my daughter's voice turned just slightly brighter whenever the waiter came near, as if she wanted to make sure he saw her as a certain kind of woman, one who belonged to the world of confident tipping and elegant indifference. I remember the way she reached across the table to move the bread basket closer to me, not in kindness, but as a cue to keep my hands occupied and still, as if I might otherwise wave them around and spill something on her new linen dress. It was such a small thing, that gesture, but it was the first cut in what I would later realize was a quiet surgery. The removal of my personhood in slow, precise slices. The bill had come, and the waiter, polite as ever, placed it by her elbow. She didn't even look at me. She took out her card, laughed about the dessert being her treat, and made a joke about earning enough to finally spoil her mother. I wanted to correct her, to remind her that the only reason she could treat anyone at all was because of the down payment I had given them 3 years earlier when they were drowning in mortgage rates and overdue medical bills, but I stayed silent. The silence was a habit, one stitched into me by decades of mothering, of keeping peace where truth might make too much noise. After breakfast the next day, she called me. Her voice was brisk, already halfway between affection and agenda. "Mom," she said, "I've been thinking, maybe you should let me handle your bank account for a bit, just until we make sure all your bills are automated. It's so easy to miss things these days." I could hear the clink of dishes in the background, the low hum of her kitchen, the distant laughter of her children. It was a warm domestic sound, but her tone was managerial. I asked her why she thought I needed help. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that doesn't include you in the humor. You're amazing, Mom, but you get distracted. Remember when you forgot to pay your phone bill last year? I didn't remind her that it was her husband who'd changed my plan without telling me and caused the mix-up. I just want to take care of you, she added. You've taken care of everyone your whole life. Let someone return the favor. I wanted to say that care offered like a leash isn't kindness, it's management, but I didn't say it. Instead, I agreed to meet her later that afternoon. When she arrived, she was all purpose and perfume. She sat at my small kitchen table, her hands busy flipping through my mail as if she were sorting evidence of my incompetence. She made notes in a small planner, the kind with gold edges. We'll link your pension to our joint account, she said. That way nothing slips through the cracks. I told her I didn't want to link anything. She smiled, as though I'd said something adorably unreasonable. You don't have to worry, Mom. I'll keep everything transparent. Transparent. Such a clean, shiny word for control. When she left, she kissed my cheek and said she'd pick me up for lunch next week. The kiss was light, perfunctory, a token gesture from someone already halfway out the door. The next morning, I noticed the small pile of mail she'd left on the counter. In it were 2 envelopes I hadn't opened, my property tax bill and a statement from the bank. I tore them open and stared at the numbers. I realized, with a sudden cold clarity, that she knew exactly how much money I had left and how easily it could be absorbed under the language of efficiency and love. That afternoon, I went for a walk around the block. The wind was sharp, but not cruel, and the trees along the street were shedding their leaves like the air itself was learning to let go. I stopped by the bakery at the corner, the one where they still remember my name, and ordered a small croissant and a coffee. The girl behind the counter, barely older than my granddaughter, smiled and said, "You always get this, right?" And I felt something like gratitude pulse through me. Being remembered, even for a pastry, felt like proof I still existed somewhere outside of someone else's calendar. I sat by the window, unwrapped the croissant, and thought about the night before, the table, the laughter, the check. I could still see my daughter's manicured hand signing the receipt, her name flowing across the paper with elegant authority. That was the moment, I think, when something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not like a break, but like a hinge loosening after years of pressure. By the time I returned home, the mail had brought another envelope. It was from the utility company, confirming an automatic payment. Only, the account number wasn't mine. It was hers. Somehow, she had already started changing things. I sat down at the table and laughed. Quietly at first, then harder, the kind of laugh that isn't amusement, but recognition. The betrayal was not sudden. It was administrative. It came dressed in good intentions and folded in paper. I wasn't furious. I was tired. Tired in a way that felt ancient, like something passed down from every woman who has been helped out of her own life. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt smaller than usual, the air tighter. I got up and made tea. While the kettle boiled, I opened the drawer where I keep old documents. The deed to the house I once owned, the birth certificates of my children, my late husband's discharge papers, the warranty for a refrigerator that died 20 years ago. The papers were yellowed, soft around the edges. I ran my hand over them, remembering how much effort it takes to keep proof of your own existence. In one envelope, I found a copy of the check I'd written for my daughter's house. The memo line read simply, "Down payment. Love you." I stared at that line until the words blurred. That was the last time I had used money to say love, and the last time love had answered back with gratitude. The next day, she called again. "I'm so glad you're letting me handle the bills," she said. "It'll make things easier for everyone." I told her she'd misunderstood. I hadn't agreed to anything. There was a long silence on the line, the kind that hums like static between two people who realize they're no longer speaking the same language. "Mom," she finally said, "don't make this hard. We're just trying to help. I said I was fine, that I'd manage on my own." She exhaled, sharp and impatient. "You always do this. You push people away when they try to care." I almost reminded her that caring shouldn't require surrender, but I didn't. The conversation ended with her saying she loved me, but it sounded like a formality, a signature at the bottom of a contract neither of us had read closely enough. That was the catalyst, though I didn't name it then. That dinner, that bill, that small act of erasure followed by a bigger one, each a thread in the unraveling fabric of who I had been. I had thought old age would bring a kind of soft invisibility, a peace in being overlooked, but it turns out there's a difference between being invisible and being erased. One is quiet, the other is violent in slow motion. I sat again at my kitchen table, my cup cooling, my hands folded around it, and I said aloud into the empty room, "Enough." The word startled me. It didn't sound like me. It sounded like my mother, like every woman who has ever realized too late that obedience is just a prettier name for disappearance. That night, I took out a small notebook, the one I used to write grocery lists in, and I began to write everything down, not for them, but for me. The receipts, the laughter, the jokes, the phone calls. Every moment that had tried to convince me I was a burden masquerading as family. I wrote until my wrist ached, until the pen left an indentation in my finger. When I finished, I looked at what I had written and whispered, "This is how it begins." And it was. That was the true moment of betrayal. Not when they laughed, not when the bill came, but when I finally saw the laughter for what it was. Permission. Permission to treat me as a relic instead of a person. That was the day I understood that my name, my choices, my money, and even my hands were being quietly transferred to someone else's keeping, and that if I didn't stop it now, soon I would not even belong to myself. The kettle whistled then, a long, thin cry through the still air, and I almost laughed again at how even the appliances seemed to have more voice than I did. I poured the water, steeped the tea, and said the word once more, softly this time, tasting its weight on my tongue. Enough. It was a small sound, but it filled the room. It was the first sound of rebellion. It was the beginning of something that would not stop. The quiet between us lasted 2 weeks, the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from strategy. My daughter didn't call, and I didn't either. I busied myself with small tasks, watering the philodendron by the window, reorganizing the cupboards, sewing the button back onto an old cardigan that no longer fit around the middle, but that I refused to give away. The days folded one into another like napkins at a dinner no one attends, each with a faint scent of something that used to be warm. When she finally called, her voice was syrupy, the way people sound when they've already decided what's best for you, but are pretending to negotiate. She said she wanted to take me grocery shopping, that I shouldn't bother carrying heavy bags alone, that she'd swing by around 10. I almost said no, but the truth is I missed her, missed even the sound of her, the quick confidence in her speech, the way she made the world sound like a list she'd already conquered. So I said yes. At the store, she pushed the cart while I followed behind, trying to keep pace with her long, purposeful strides. She kept her phone in one hand, tapping messages, laughing under her breath at things unseen. Occasionally, she would hold up a product and ask if I still used it, as if I were some museum exhibit of obsolete habits. When we reached the dairy aisle, she grabbed a carton of almond milk and said, "You should switch. It's better for you. Whole milk isn't for your generation anymore." The phrase caught me like a thorn. Your generation, as if I belonged to a separate species with different laws of gravity. I nodded, though I hate the taste of almonds, and placed the carton in the cart. It was easier to let the small things pass, but every concession leaves a trace, and I could feel them collecting like stones in a pocket. At the register, she paid, of course, she always insisted. And when I reached for my wallet, she waved me off with the same gesture she once used to hush her children in church. "You don't have to worry about that anymore," she said, sliding her card with a practiced flick of the wrist. I wanted to ask what that meant, independence, dignity, but I said nothing. In the car, she chatted about her work, her colleagues, a new position that might come with more travel. "You'd love it, Mom," she said. "They have these retreats in Aspen. Maybe one day I'll take you." I smiled because that's what was expected, though I knew there would never be such a day. People who promise future kindness are usually just buying silence in the present. Back home, she helped me unpack the groceries, rearranging my shelves as if I were a guest in my own kitchen. She put the almond milk at the front of the refrigerator, moved my jar of sugar to a different cupboard, and left a note taped to the counter that said, "Don't forget your new vitamins. Love you." I stared at it after she left, at the round, confident loops of her handwriting, and felt a strange ache of pride and resentment tangled together. I had taught her those letters when she was 5, sitting at the kitchen table with a pencil that kept slipping through her small fingers. I had shown her how to loop the L and stretch the Y so it looked graceful. Now those same loops spelled instructions for me. There's a kind of poetry in that reversal, but not the kind that leaves you comforted. That night, I poured myself a glass of water and realized that even the glass didn't feel like mine anymore. It had been a gift from her, part of a set she brought over when she said my old mismatched ones looked a little sad. I looked around my apartment, the neutral curtains she'd picked, the framed photo she'd insisted on hanging of us, smiling on my 75th birthday, the rug she'd ordered online to brighten up the space. Everywhere I turned, there was evidence of her careful curation, as though she were staging my life for resale. The walls were mine, but the choices were hers, and that realization settled on me like a fog. A week later, I received a call from the bank. A polite man asked to confirm that I had added a secondary user to my account. I froze, my hand tightening around the receiver. "No," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "There must be a mistake." He apologized, said it was probably a clerical error, and promised to send a verification form. When the envelope arrived 2 days later, I saw her name printed neatly beneath mine, co-owner. I read it twice, then again, as if repetition might change the letters. I didn't call her immediately. I needed to sit with the fury to make sure it wasn't confusion, but it wasn't. It was deliberate, measured, executed with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. That evening I made soup, an old recipe of my mother's, thick with lentils and garlic, the kind that fills the air with the smell of earth and patience. I ate it slowly, listening to the clock tick. Around 9 she called, cheerful as ever. "Just wanted to check in," she said. "Everything good?" I told her about the bank. There was a pause, a single beat, then a sigh that sounded almost rehearsed. "Oh, Mom, I told you about that. It's just to make things smoother. The bank needs a cosigner now for certain transactions. I asked her when she had planned to tell me. She said she thought she had. I said she hadn't. The conversation drifted into that familiar territory of half-truths and evasions. "You have to trust me," she said finally, a phrase that always arrives right after you've been given reason not to. When we hung up, I felt something settle into me. Not rage exactly, but an understanding. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a miscommunication. It was the quiet conversion of my life into her project. Every decision she made, even the kind ones, carried a signature of possession. And I had allowed it, inch by inch, transaction by transaction. The night stretched long, the walls breathing with their slow nocturnal hum. And I thought of the bill at the restaurant, the waiter's polite smile, the way my name had vanished from the record of that evening. This was just another receipt with my signature missing. The next morning, I walked to the library. It was a small brick building with a roof that always smelled faintly of rain. I asked the woman at the desk where I could find information about senior housing. She pointed to a rack of brochures and smiled kindly, the kind of smile that makes you believe kindness might still exist without an invoice attached. I took a few pamphlets, sat at a corner table, and began to read. Most of the options were dreary: shared bathrooms, waiting lists, income restrictions. But the mere act of reading them felt radical. To imagine a space that was mine alone, not curated or approved by anyone, was intoxicating. I stayed until the librarian flicked the lights to signal closing time, and as I left, she pressed a card into my hand with her name written on it. "If you need help filling forms," she said, "come by next week. We have volunteers." That evening, back in my apartment, I opened a drawer and found my old wedding ring. I hadn't worn it in years. It no longer fit my swollen finger, but I slid it onto the chain around my neck and let it rest against my chest. It was heavy, reassuringly so, like a reminder of a time when belonging was mutual, not managed. I looked at my reflection in the dark window, the faint outline of my face, and said, "We're not done yet." The reflection said nothing, but I swear the shadow of my mouth curved upward just enough to suggest agreement. Over the next few days, I began to make small corrections to my life. I changed the password to my online bank account. I started carrying cash again, folded neatly in a small envelope tucked inside my wallet. I moved the framed photo of us to a drawer and replaced it with a picture of my garden from the old house. Rows of marigolds and tomatoes, the soil so dark it looked like chocolate. It felt like reclaiming a small country that had been occupied without resistance. My daughter noticed, of course. She came by one afternoon unannounced, holding a container of soup as if it were a peace offering. "You didn't answer my texts," she said. I told her I'd been busy. "Busy with what?" she asked, her tone slipping toward irritation. "Just paperwork." Her eyes narrowed, assessing. "What kind of paperwork?" "The kind that makes things smoother," I said, and I saw the flicker of confusion before the smile returned. She talked about her week, the kids, the trip she was planning, the usual noise of a life full of movement. I listened politely, nodding in the right places, but my mind was elsewhere, on the forms in my drawer, on the librarian's card, on the quiet possibility of freedom. When she left, she hugged me, the scent of her perfume lingering like a foreign language. I stood by the door long after she'd gone, hand resting on the knob, and felt the oddest mixture of sorrow and triumph. The first escalation, though I didn't know to call it that, was already in motion. It wasn't a confrontation or a revelation. It was the slow return of gravity to a life that had been floating in someone else's orbit. I was beginning to pull myself back, inch by inch, not with noise or anger, but with precision. Freedom doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just starts rearranging the furniture quietly at night, waiting for you to notice. The first letter from the housing office arrived on a Tuesday, folded twice and smelling faintly of ink. I almost didn't open it. Official mail tends to bring requests, not relief, and I had grown tired of forms that treat the elderly like mismatched furniture waiting to be placed somewhere convenient. But when I finally slid my finger along the seal and unfolded the paper, I saw the words that made me sit down right there at the kitchen table. Your application for independent senior living has been approved, pending confirmation. It was the word independent that caught me. Such a small, bureaucratic word, so easily overlooked, yet it trembled on the page like something alive. I read it 3 times, not because I doubted it, but because I needed to feel the sound of it settle in my mouth. Independent, mine. Not shared, not managed, not supervised, mine. I looked around the apartment that had been so carefully helped into order. Her curtains, her rug, her note about vitamins, and I realized how completely I had been living in a museum of her good intentions. That letter was not a doorway yet, but it was the first crack of light under one. I folded the paper neatly, slid it into a drawer under the old recipe cards I no longer used, and made tea to steady myself. As I stirred the spoon, I caught my reflection in the kettle and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her hair had gone thinner, yes, her jaw softer, but there was something sharper in the eyes now, a glint I hadn't seen since my husband was alive, and we still dared to make plans without permission. For years I had told myself that dignity was something you could preserve quietly, like jam sealed in the pantry, but now I understood it had to be made fresh, again and again, or it spoiled into obedience. That afternoon, I went to the community center to ask about volunteer work. The young woman at the desk blinked when I told her my age, as though 82 were a diagnosis instead of a number. She said they always needed people to help with the after-school reading program, someone to sit with children while they stumbled over words too big for their mouths. I thought of my granddaughter at that age, how she'd mispronounced dinosaur as dinosnor, and how I had laughed until she frowned and demanded I take it seriously. I can do that, I said, and signed my name on the line with a hand that didn't tremble. As I wrote, I thought about all the times I'd signed documents for others, permission slips, checks, consent forms, and how rarely I'd signed anything for myself. The ink bled slightly on the paper, but the name looked strong. Later that week, I began sorting through my things, pretending it was for spring cleaning, though spring was months away. I filled 3 boxes with clothes that no longer fit, 2 with kitchen items I never used, and 1 with photographs. I kept the ones where I looked like myself, hair a little unruly, apron tied loosely, eyes alive with mischief. I discarded the posed ones, the family portraits where my smile was tight and someone's hand rested possessively on my shoulder. There's an honesty to clutter when you live alone. Each item keeps its story. When you live under someone else's roof, even objects learn to behave. By the time my daughter called again, the apartment looked different, lighter. She noticed immediately when she came by. "Where's the rug?" she asked, standing in the doorway like an inspector. "I gave it away," I said. "It was too loud." She frowned. "You love that rug." "You love that rug," I corrected gently. "I just stepped around it." She laughed, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're in a mood today." I smiled. "I'm in a mood every day." I just stopped apologizing for it. She didn't know what to say to that, so she changed the subject, talked about her children's schedules, her husband's business trip, her own exhaustion. I listened, because that's what mothers do. We are the echo chambers for our children's noise, the proof that someone is still willing to hold the other end of the line. But as she talked, I realized something quietly liberating. Her life no longer required my participation to continue. It ran on its own clockwork, shiny and self-sufficient. That meant I was free to build one of my own. The next morning I went downtown to visit the building I might soon call home. It was modest, pale brick with wide steps and geraniums in window boxes. The manager, a wiry woman named Grace with hair like steel wool and the posture of a retired soldier, showed me around. The apartment itself was small, a single bedroom, a kitchenette, a window that faced east, but it had a feeling I couldn't name at first. Then it came to me. Silence, the good kind. The kind that isn't absence, but space. Grace said the rent would be manageable and that I could move in within the month. "We like tenants who keep things simple," she said. "No drama, no noise." I told her she'd come to the right woman. When I left the building, the sun had risen high enough to warm the back of my neck. I walked slowly down the street, passing a bakery that smelled like sugar and patience, and stopped to look in the window. Rows of pastries gleamed under glass, and behind the counter, an older man was kneading dough with large flour-dusted hands. His movements were deliberate, tender. Watching him, I realized how long it had been since I used my own hands for anything beyond necessity. Once, they had known rhythm and purpose, kneading, stitching, planting, comforting. Now they mostly hovered in my lap, waiting for permission to move. I went inside, ordered a small loaf of bread, and asked if he ever needed help. He looked up, surprised, then smiled. "Everyone needs help," he said. "Come by in the mornings if you're serious." I nodded, even though I wasn't sure yet if I could commit. Still, the idea of working again, even a little, felt like remembering a song I used to know by heart. That night, I took the approval letter out of the drawer and placed it on the table. The lamp's light fell across it like a benediction. I thought of calling my daughter to tell her, to see how she'd react, but I knew how that conversation would go. Concern wrapped in control, pity disguised as love. Instead, I wrote a note on the back of an envelope, nothing dramatic, just a line to steady my own resolve. "You still belong to yourself." I pinned it to the corkboard above the sink, right next to the shopping list. Sometimes you need reminders more than groceries. Over the next week, I began to move quietly toward this new life. I told no one. I visited the community center each afternoon to help the children read, and when they stumbled over words, I taught them patience, not speed. One boy, Leo, always looked at my hands when I pointed to the page. "Your skin looks like paper," he said once. "That's because it's full of stories," I told him, and he grinned, as if he'd discovered a secret. At the end of each session, he would pat my wrist gently before running off, a gesture so innocent it undid me. To be touched without pity, that is a gift people forget how to give. I also started saving every bit I could. I stopped buying the expensive groceries my daughter preferred and went back to the staples of my youth: rice, beans, onions, lentils. It was strange how frugality, once born of necessity, now felt like freedom. Every coin I set aside was a small act of rebellion, a seed for the future. When I reached a modest sum, I bought a second-hand suitcase from the thrift store down the street. It smelled faintly of cedar and adventure. I kept it under the bed, empty for now, but ready, like an unspoken sentence waiting for its verb. On the last Friday of the month, I took a walk to the river. The air was cool, the sky uncertain. Along the path, a group of teenagers were taking photos, their laughter bright and careless. One of them glanced at me and smiled, not mockingly, just with the simple recognition of another human being sharing the afternoon. It startled me how rare that felt. I sat on a bench and watched the water slide under the bridge, slow and deliberate, carrying nothing but itself. That was when it struck me. I had spent most of my life being useful, and now I wanted, just once, to be whole. When I got home, I found a voicemail from my daughter. Her voice was tight, hurried. She said she'd been looking at my finances and was worried about some recent withdrawals. She asked if everything was all right, and then, in that careful tone she uses when she wants to sound reasonable, she added, "You know, Mom, we could move you closer to us. There's a new assisted living community opening soon. You'd have company, activities, safety." I listened twice. The first time I felt the usual sting of disappointment. The second time I laughed, quietly, because it was so predictable. Safety is always the word people use when they mean control. I deleted the message, turned off the phone, and stood by the window. Outside, the sky had turned the color of pewter, heavy, but not yet raining. I pressed my palm to the glass and whispered to my reflection, "Not yet." That night, I slept deeply, dreamlessly, the way people do when they finally made a decision, even if they haven't spoken it aloud. The next morning, I woke before dawn, the city still gray, and made coffee. I stood by the window, watching the first hint of light split the horizon, and for the first time in years, I felt not old, but early, like a beginning rather than an after. They didn't come with flowers or apologies or even the bright, brittle cheerfulness that people wear like armor when they know they are wrong and are hoping the performance will cover the debt. They came with paperwork. My daughter stood in the doorway, holding a manila folder so fat it seemed to breathe, and behind her the son-in-law hovered with the tense managerial smile of someone prepared to de-escalate what his emails would later call a family situation, and before I could offer them tea or decline to, they moved past me into the living room as if I were the owner of a waiting room, rather than the woman whose life those papers hoped to amend. She began to speak in the voice I know best, the one that sounds like an assistant principal practicing kindness in a hallway full of noise, and she said there had been some concerns about my recent activity, that certain withdrawals looked out of pattern, that she had spoken to the bank and to a counselor at a senior services agency, and that everyone agreed it would be best. She always said best as if it were a neutral word, for me to let her streamline things, and while she talked, she spread the papers across my coffee table like a map of a country I was being invited to leave. I recognized the shapes: a new durable power of attorney pre-filled with her name, a medical release form authorizing her to speak with my doctors, a printout of a brochure for an assisted living residence with high windows and tasteful furniture, even an outline for transition logistics, as if I were cargo, as if my memories could be packed in a box labeled fragile, and the rest thrown into a truck that would reverse down my past without ever checking the mirrors. I asked them to sit, not because I wanted them comfortable, but because I needed my hands free, and I folded those hands in my lap and listened the way women listen when they already know the answer, but are trying to remember whether mercy is the same as delay. And he talked now in his calm, well-shaped sentences about risk and planning and the generosity of a buy-in at the facility that would take the pressure off everyone. And my daughter nodded at the right places and added stories I did not recognize, like the time I forgot the stove on and nearly started a fire, which was in fact the night her son left a pizza box on a burner, and I caught it smoking before the alarm woke the baby, or the time I lost my keys, and we had to call a locksmith, which was the afternoon she took my keys by mistake and returned them 3 days later with a joke about how old hands shouldn't have to carry heavy keychains, and while they stacked inaccuracies with the confidence of people building on a foundation no one had inspected, I understood that this was not a conversation but a formal notice. They had already decided who I was, and they had convened to inform me. I told them I appreciated their concern and that I was managing fine, and I watched the small flicker pass over my daughter's face. A momentary shadow of the girl who used to bite her lip when the plan she had made met the world she could not shape, but then it was gone, and she slid the first form toward me as if my signature were a hiccup on its way out, and I could feel my pulse in my fingers, that old drummer in the wrists that shows up when truth is required. And I said I would not sign anything today, and her laugh was a small spill of glass beads across tile, pretty but cold, and she said, "Of course not today. We can take our time." And then with immaculate casualness, she picked up the envelope resting on the edge of my table, the one I had forgotten to hide, with the senior housing logo peeking like a secret telling on itself, and her voice changed key without changing volume, a musician shifting scales mid-song so smoothly the audience believes the music had always been written that way. "What is this?" she asked, though she already knew, and I told her, and she shook her head the way people do when they see a child reaching for the stove, sadness mixed with scold, and she said, "Independent was a beautiful word, but not a realistic plan, not with my current condition." And I asked what condition she meant, and she said the condition of time, which was almost clever enough to pass for wisdom if it hadn't been an argument for custody. When they left, the papers remained, a white glare on my wooden table, and I stood at the sink and ran water over a mug I wasn't washing. And I remembered the way the waiter had placed the bill at dinner, the delicate choreography of that gesture, the practiced certainty, and I understood that bills and forms are cousins, both instruments of placement, and that the second escalation of this story was not going to be an outburst or a slammed door, but a series of signatures, mine withheld and theirs multiplying, a slow tightening of the ring around the part of me they still believed they could manage into gratitude. 2 days later, a stranger knocked, a woman with kind eyes and a notebook who introduced herself as a caseworker following up on a wellness call, and I invited her in because I have never known how to be rude to people whose job is to carry other people's heat, and she asked about my medications and my meals and whether I felt safe, and I answered plainly. And I saw her taking my measure, the way nurses do, not by weight or height, but by coherence, by the elasticity of answers. And at the end, she said what caseworkers say when they cannot fix the family but can document the day. "You seem capable to me, but you know your daughter is worried." And I told her I did know, and that worry had always been my daughter's favorite grammar, a way of turning control into a love letter. She gave me a list of free legal clinics, slipped it onto the table like a card a good magician palms to the right person at the right time, and when she left, I put the list under the housing letter, as if paper could protect paper. The next week, the bank called to inform me there had been unusual activity, and now it was my turn to sit at a desk in a cooled room with a stranger whose tie was too tight, while he explained that certain features on my account had been optimized, and that to de-optimize them, we would need the co-signer present. And I told him I had not authorized a cosigner, and he did the sad smile bankers do when the world has already moved 3 steps past the point where your grievance can be translated into policy, and he suggested I open a separate account for spending the way you suggest a playground for a child while the adults talk business across the street. I thanked him because it costs nothing to be polite and sometimes purchases you a second look, and he gave me one, a longer look, the kind people reserve for old women who sound unusually precise, and he slid another card across the desk with the schedule for a pro bono elder law clinic and said almost in a whisper that it was useful to know your words. I walked out with the new account with $20 in cash and a sense that while the institutions might be arranged against me, within them there were still people who could see the trail of a person under the paperwork. At the community center, the children kept reading, and my hands kept pointing and tracing and turning pages. And one afternoon, the librarian whose card I had kept in my purse sat beside me as Leo rolled the word caterpillar around like a marble. And when he skipped the syllable with the patient audacity only 7-year-olds have, she laughed and told him to bite it in the middle and chew. And after he ran to the sports room, she asked, as if talking about a neighbor's fence, whether my daughter had calmed down, which is how I learned that my daughter had been making a few calls of her own, and I felt the hot rush of embarrassment that travels quickly in the veins of women trained to believe family revelations are a form of nudity. And then, just as quickly, I felt it cool into something firmer, because shame is a leash, and I had begun to walk without collars. The librarian said their legal clinic met Thursdays. The lawyer was practical and not impressed by theatrics, and I said I would come. And when Thursday arrived, I sat across from a woman in a navy suit who listened the way surgeons look at scans, and I told her the story with as few adjectives as possible, and she nodded and said a sentence that changed the air in my chest. Capacity is not a vibe, it's a standard. She wrote down steps that sounded simple and therefore brave. Revoke, notify, document, duplicate keys, change pins, send certified letters, and most importantly, speak first in writing, because words that live on paper grow roots. My daughter responded to my new quiet with noise. There were texts layered on texts, voicemails pitched to the careful register of reasonable worry, a message from my granddaughter inviting me to a manicure girls' afternoon with a photo of glossy young hands resting on a slab of marble like fresh fruit on display, and then the pivot I had expected, an invitation to Sunday brunch to talk things through at a place with chandeliers and soft chairs and waiters who hover, as if comfort were an argument I could be worn down by. I agreed, not because I believed in the talk, but because I wanted to choose the table where the second act of the performance would unfold. I wore the navy dress again, and the ring on its chain, and tucked the legal clinic's notes into my purse, the way a person carries a compass, even if the road is straight. And when I arrived, I saw them already seated, my daughter, with her elbows on the table as if holding it steady by posture alone, the son-in-law consulting a phone they would later pretend to put away, the granddaughter radiant and awkward in the way of girls who love their mirrors and are still learning to love their elders. They started well. I will give them that. There was genuine warmth in the first 5 minutes, stories about the children, an apology shaped like a joke for invading my space with papers, and even a compliment on my dress, and then, like a tide. Obeying its own moon, the conversation drifted toward the cove they had charted. the gentle insistence that the world is complicated and adults must consolidate, that care is smoother when centralized, that families are safer when led by the most, equipped. And I let the water lap, and then I put my hands on the table, palms down, not flat and not clenched. And I told them I had visited the housing building and that I liked the way the morning reached the window. And my daughter said, moving now would be rash and lonely and expensive and unnecessary. And I told her I had saved before and could save again. And she said, the numbers don't add up. And I told her that numbers add up differently when the person doing the math is the one paying the bill. And right on cue, the waiter approached and set the leather folder by my son-in-law's elbow and thanked him for joining them. And I looked at the folder and couldn't help the smallest smile because I was being given the old chorus. And I decided to sing a different harmony. I reached for the folder, and the waiter's eyes flickered, and my daughter laughed good-naturedly and said, let him get this, Mom. He likes to. And I said, so do I, and slid my card into the sleeve before anyone could narrate me back into their comfort. And while it processed, I didn't argue or defend or explain. I just let the silence do the arithmetic on their faces. And when the waiter returned and set the slip before me and handed me a pen that had been touched by so many hands, it had learned small prayers in multiple languages. I wrote my name with the steady care I reserve for holidays and legalities. And I left the tip not to prove anything, but because people who work for a living deserve to go home with proof that the day recognized them. That should have been the end of a scene and the beginning of a truce. But escalation is a creature that eats quiet and grows. And 2 nights later, the son-in-law sent an email with 3 attachments and a subject line that used the word urgent, and the attachments were an intake packet for the facility, a calendar with dates already circled, and a letter addressed to whom it may concern, describing a woman whose decline would have made me cry for her if I hadn't recognized the timeline as my own. And in the body of the email, he wrote that he hoped we could complete these steps before things became adversarial. And I sat very still at my kitchen table and felt that old heat of panic rise and then pass like weather, because once someone names the battlefield, you can stop being surprised by the artillery. In the morning, there was a knock, and it was the caseworker again, apologetic but firm. And she said she had to follow up on a report that I was forgetting to eat, confusing dates, misplacing medications. And I opened my refrigerator and showed her soup and eggs and rice and beans. I showed her the calendar where my own looped handwriting charted days without apologizing for their unevenness. I opened the pill organizer, labeled by a nurse at the clinic, and counted the tablets with her. And at the end, she sat and sighed and said, I know what this is. And I said, I do too. And she asked me if I was frightened. And I told her fear had changed shape for me. It used to look like the world without my family. And now it looked like my family deciding I was the world and they were the administrators. I would like to tell you I was brave at every turn, that I ate well and slept deeply and walked with a straight back through their manufactured storms. But the truth is more ordinary and therefore truer. Some nights I stared at the ceiling until the plaster arranged itself into maps of places I'd never been. Some afternoons I forgot where I put the new key and cried, not because of the key, but because I know how the story of a lost key is used by people who have a script to feed. Some mornings, I answered the phone when I should not have, and listened to my granddaughter talk with the unearned certainty of youth about preemptive planning. And when I asked her who taught her that phrase, she said, innocently, Dad, and my heart made the sound a bridge makes when a truck heavier than the designers imagined moves across it in rain, not breaking, not yet, but learning the exact measure of its own stress. Still, in the same days, there were counterweights. The baker who waved me behind the counter one dawn and showed me how to dust flour across the peel so the loaf slid obediently onto the stone, and he said my hands were steady, and I told him they had. Practice, the librarian who found me a poem about women who do not startle and slipped it into my bag. Leo spelling butterfly without help, and then insisting on drawing one with too many wings, which is the right number if you are 7, and the building manager Grace calling to say the unit would be ready sooner than expected if I still wanted it, and me saying yes without asking anyone's permission, the word yes coming out of my mouth like fresh bread cracking. The pressure did not stop, because pressure never stops by itself. It adjusts to the container. My daughter arrived one evening with dinner I had not asked for, and she set it on the counter and looked at me with a softness that almost found me. And she said she was sorry about the email and the forms and the calls, that things had gotten out of hand, that she was just trying to keep me safe. And I believed the part of her that meant it, the girl who still lives inside the woman who learned how to win by securing the perimeter. And I told her I loved her, and that love is not a power of attorney. And she nodded and cried a little, and then, almost absently, she reached for my purse and said, "Let me at least take your cards to update the billing addresses." And I put my hand over the purse and said gently, "No," and we stood like that. For a moment, 2 women on either side of a small leather bag that had somehow become the last square of a contested country, and then she let go, and for a second we were only mother and daughter again, tired in the same bones. When she left, I locked the door, not because of her, not exactly, but because I had learned how air moves through a house when windows are left open for other people's convenience. And so the days grew louder, and I grew quieter, which is not the same as shrinking. It is the discipline of a person who knows that the next move must be decisive and clean. And until then, small talk is the enemy of resolve. I prepared what could be prepared without triggering alarms. I copied documents. I tucked cash in a place my younger self would have laughed at. I boxed the essentials in a way that made the room look merely tidier. I wrote a list of what I would carry that was not made of cloth or paper. My mother's way of seeing, my husband's way of listening, the children's names as they sounded in my mouth when I said them before anyone else did, the feel of my garden soil in April, the timetable of buses I once knew by heart, the poem the librarian had smuggled into my bag, the weight of the baker's peel in my palms, the precise cadence of the word no. I kept volunteering. I kept buying rice. I kept breathing slowly when the phone lit up with numbers that offered me solutions to problems they were busy inventing. If this was an escalation, it was not theirs anymore. It was mine, and it measured not how much pressure they could apply, but how steadily I could hold to the shape of myself, while the air around me argued otherwise. It was raining the morning I left, the kind of soft, disciplined rain that never hurries and never stops, a rain that seems to know its purpose. I woke before dawn, not from anxiety, but from clarity, that rare hour when the mind and the body reach a truce. The decision was not sudden. It had been ripening in me for weeks, like fruit that must fall to avoid rotting. I moved through the apartment quietly, not because I feared being caught. There was no one to catch me, but because silence felt like the proper language for what I was doing. I brewed coffee and drank it standing by the window, watching the reflection of streetlights slide along the wet pavement. For the first time in years, the world looked clean. On the table, the small suitcase waited, its brass clasps polished, its corners frayed from other lives. Inside lay only what was necessary: 2 dresses, my papers, a handful of letters, the photograph of my garden, the ring on its chain, and a notebook filled with the small, unglamorous arithmetic of survival. When I zipped it shut, the sound was like a line being drawn across the past. I had written my daughter a letter the night before, though calling it a letter makes it sound softer than it was. It was not an apology, not a justification, not a performance. It was an accounting. I listed the things I had given her: time, money, faith, my silence, and then I listed what I was taking back: my name, my choices, my hands. I told her she was free to interpret this as abandonment if it helped her sleep, but I hoped she might someday see it for what it was: a correction, a realignment of weight. At the end, I wrote only this: a mother's love is not property. It cannot be transferred or notarized. It is an energy, and energy returns to its source. I left the envelope on the table, weighed down by the salt shaker, in case she came looking for evidence. I did not expect her to understand immediately. Understanding requires absence. When the taxi arrived, I locked the door behind me with deliberate calm. The key felt cold and light in my hand. I turned it twice and slid it through the mail slot, a small act of finality that made my throat tighten. The driver, a man with eyes that looked too tired to ask questions, helped with the suitcase. "Going far?" he said. "Far enough," I answered. We drove through the city in a hush that felt sacred. The streets were still half asleep, the shop awnings glistening, the sky a flat sheet of pewter. I watched the neighborhoods change, the neat lawns giving way to cracked sidewalks, then to the quiet stretch of industrial lots where the air smelled faintly of metal and yeast. I felt no fear, only an expanding calm, as if my bones were rearranging themselves to make room for breath. Freedom doesn't always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives disguised as routine: a cab ride, a light rain, a woman looking out the window and realizing that the past can no longer claim rent. When we reached the building, Grace was waiting under the awning, her umbrella tilted at a militant angle. "You made it," she said, not as surprise but as confirmation. She helped me carry the suitcase upstairs. The apartment was smaller than I remembered, the paint a little chipped, but it had windows on both sides, and the air smelled faintly of soap and possibility. "It's yours," she said. I nodded, though the words took a moment to land. Yours. Ownership as existence. She handed me the keys, 2 of them, shiny and unmarked, and said she'd return later with the lease for my signature. "No rush," she added. "We don't chase anyone here." When she left, I sat on the bed and looked around at the blank walls, the unscuffed floor, the single bulb hanging like a small moon. I laughed, quietly at first, then deeper, because I had not realized how heavy the invisible furniture of permission had become until I set it down. The rain kept on. I unpacked slowly, touching each item like a prayer. The photograph went on the nightstand, the notebook in the drawer, the ring on the windowsill where the light could reach it. I hung my dresses in the small closet and folded the sweaters with the deliberate neatness of someone building a new ritual. When everything was in place, I sat again, not out of fatigue, but reverence. The silence was complete, not the sterile quiet of being ignored, but the generous kind that expands to fit your breathing. It was then that I allowed myself to cry, not from sadness, but from recognition. I was home, though the word now meant something it never had before. It did not mean family or permanence or safety. It meant sovereignty. It meant I could leave the cup unwashed if I wanted. It meant I could open the window and not worry about drafts. It meant no one would rearrange the shelves in the name of care. That evening I walked to the bakery. The air smelled of rain-soaked bread and exhaust, and the pavement glittered like an old photograph. The baker looked up when I entered, his hands white with flour. "You're late," he said, smiling. "Had to move," I answered. "Ah," he nodded, as if that explained everything. He gave me a loaf still warm from the oven and refused my money. "First day deserves a gift," he said. I carried the bread home wrapped in its paper, feeling absurdly rich. Back in the apartment, I tore off a piece and ate it standing at the counter. The crust was crisp, the inside soft and steaming. I thought of all the dinners where I had eaten politely, carefully, under someone else's gaze, and how this single mouthful tasted like defiance. There are rebellions that make noise, and there are rebellions that chew quietly and swallow. Later that night, as I was preparing for bed, the phone rang. It was her, of course. I had expected it, though not so soon. Her voice was trembling, though she tried to steady it. "Where are you?" she demanded. I told her I was safe. "Safe where?" she asked. "Somewhere you don't need to manage," I said. There was silence, then a broken laugh that sounded almost like relief. "You can't just disappear, Mom." "I didn't disappear," I said. "I arrived." She said she didn't understand, and I told her she didn't need to yet. "You raised me to be strong," I reminded her. "This is what strong looks like when it's old." She started to cry. I didn't. Tears are for those who haven't yet decided. When she asked if I would come back, I said, "Not unless I'm invited as a guest, not as a responsibility." I could hear her breathing, quick and uneven, and for a moment I almost softened. But then I saw the forms, the folders, the signatures, the whole machinery of well-intentioned erasure, and I knew pity would only rebuild the cage. "I love you," she said. "I know," I answered, and I hung up before love could turn back into leverage. Sleep came easily. In the dark, I felt my hands resting on the blanket, palms open, fingers relaxed, as if they were finally being released from a long contract. I dreamed of my garden, the marigolds rising stubbornly through the soil, the scent of wet leaves, the sound of bees moving like small engines of continuity. In the dream, no one mocked my hands. They were part of the earth, necessary and unremarkable, doing what hands are meant to do, making, tending, repairing. The next morning, the light came in clean and unfiltered. I made coffee and stood by the window again, watching the people below rushing with umbrellas, the buses exhaling clouds, the bakery truck unloading. The world looked indifferent, and that indifference was a gift. I opened my notebook and began to write. Not a letter this time, not a complaint, just a record of presence. Day 1, I wrote. No one called me a burden today. No one thanked me for existing. I watered the geranium. I read a poem. I am here. I paused, then added, my hands are mine again. By afternoon, I had already begun a new routine. I went to the community center and told the librarian I could still volunteer. She hugged me, and I smelled paper and lemon soap in her hair. "You look different," she said. "Lighter." I smiled. "It's just the rain," I said, but she shook her head. "No, it's not." I spent 2 hours with the children, helping them with spelling, tracing their little fingers along words that would someday betray and redeem them in equal measure. When I returned home, there was a message from the landlord confirming the lease signing for the next morning. I placed the note beside the bread and looked around. It no longer felt like a temporary room. It felt like a life. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, I lit a small candle and set it by the window. Not as ritual or superstition, but as testimony. The flame flickered gently, reflected in the glass, 2 fires facing each other. I whispered to the one inside, "You did it." And for once, the echo didn't come from memory, but from the present. I took off the ring from its chain and slid it onto my finger, though it was tight. It fit enough. I held it up to the candlelight, and it gleamed, not like jewelry, but like truth. For years, my hands had been mocked, managed, pitied. Now they glowed, not with youth, but with use, with every scar and line turned into evidence. They looked exactly as they should, strong, imperfect, alive. The rain stopped the next morning, leaving the city rinsed and tentative, as if everything had been rewritten overnight. I woke to the sound of quiet that wasn't empty, just clean, the kind that carries the small movements of life. A bus sighing at the corner, a pigeon's wings brushing the windowsill, the whisper of my own breath acknowledging its place. My body ached in the gentle way that follows long travel, not from miles, but from decision. I rose slowly, made coffee, and sat by the window with the cup warm against my palms. Outside, the sky was low and pale, the kind of color that invites thought. I looked down at my hands, still freckled, still veined, still undeniably mine, and realized they had stopped trembling. The skin no longer felt foreign. It was the map of a country I could finally name. They were not graceful or young, but they were truthful. Truth, I had learned, does not need to be smooth to be beautiful. Later that day, Grace brought the lease for me to sign. We sat at the small kitchen table, the same one where I had once been told what to sign and where. Now the paper lay before me, flat and waiting, and my pen was steady. When I wrote my name, the letters bloomed across the page like something growing back after drought. Grace said, "Welcome home," and the words, so simple, so human, filled the room more completely than any ceremony could. After she left, I left the signed copy open for a while, just to watch my name dry into the paper, to see it become permanent in its quiet way. I didn't cry. There are tears that belong to grief, and tears that belong to relief, and then there is something else, an internal stillness that feels like breathing for the first time after a long climb. That's what I felt. In the following weeks, I built a rhythm that belonged only to me. Mornings began with a walk to the bakery, where the baker still insisted on handing me the first loaf of the day. I learned the names of the pigeons that lingered near the benches. At the community center, Leo finished his book, every word his own, and handed it to me like a diploma. He said, "I think you fixed my reading." And I laughed and told him it was always his to fix. I started attending the Thursday poetry group for seniors, not to read but to listen. Words spoken by others began to sound like my own breath reflected back, and for the first time in decades, I could sit among people without feeling I owed them anything. Each evening, I returned home to my apartment that still smelled faintly of paint and bread, and I would touch the wall by the door as if to greet it. A home, I decided, is not a place that shelters you from weather. It's the place that teaches you how to stand in it without shrinking. Sometimes, of course, the phone rang. My daughter called less often now, as if she too was learning a different kind of silence. Our conversations were careful, but softer. She told me about the children, about work, about small things. She never mentioned the forms or the calls or the reports. We talked as two women do who are trying to build something new out of the wreckage of what was meant to protect them. I no longer spoke to her with the trembling patience of someone seeking permission. My words came from a level ground. Once, near the end of a call, she said quietly, "You sound happy." And I told her the truth. I am not happy, but I am whole. That's better. She didn't answer right away, but when she did, her voice was small, almost like the girl she had been when she used to fall asleep on my lap. Whole is good, Mom, she said. Whole is enough. On my 79th birthday, I decided to hold a small gathering in the community kitchen downstairs. I baked bread with the baker's help. The children from the reading class brought hand-drawn cards, and Grace made tea that tasted like sunlight and herbs. There was laughter, not the brittle, self-conscious kind from restaurant dinners, but the warm, unarranged laughter of people who have nothing to prove. I looked around the table and realized how ordinary it was and how deeply that ordinariness mattered. No one needed to declare love or obligation. We were simply present, which is rarer and kinder. I thought then of the restaurant from months ago, of the way my daughter's hand had hovered near the bill, of the way the waiter had looked at me without seeing. I could still feel the sting, but now it felt historical, like an old scar that no longer dictates how you move. Pain, once understood, stops asking for attention. That evening, after everyone had gone, I returned upstairs and wrote another note, this one small and simple. I pinned it above the stove where I could see it each morning. It said, "You kept the promise." It wasn't a promise to anyone else. It was to the girl I had once been, the one who thought endurance was love, silence was grace, and usefulness was safety. I wanted her to know we had outlived all of that. Sometimes I catch my reflection in the dark glass of the window, and I see her watching me, her young eyes wide, not quite believing we made it. I nod to her and whisper, "We did." Now, when I walk through the city, people sometimes offer me their seats on the bus, and I accept or decline depending on how my knees feel, not on pride. My hands still ache when it rains, but the ache has become a kind of clock, marking time honestly. At the market, I pay for my groceries with my own card, and the cashier hands me the receipt without looking for anyone else's name. Each small act feels like a closing circle, each signature a return to self. I don't need to be thanked anymore. Gratitude is no longer a language I trade in. It's simply the air I breathe when I remember that I am alive on my own terms. Some nights, before bed, I sit by the window and watch the lights flicker across the wet roofs, and I think about the women I have known, my mother, my friends, the ones who stayed, the ones who left too late, and the ones who never learned they were allowed to go. I want to tell them what I've learned, that it's not too late to begin again, that dignity does not vanish with age unless you hand it away, that silence is not peace unless you choose it. If I could send a message through the thin wall of time to another woman sitting somewhere tonight with her head bowed over her lap, ashamed of hands that no longer look young, I would say this: lift them. Let them rest on the table. Let the light find them. These are the hands that paid, that built, that held, that mended. They are your proof. You owe no apology for their history. When I turn off the lamp, the apartment sinks into darkness, but it is a gentle darkness, one that belongs to me. I listen to the hum of the refrigerator, to the faint rhythm of my own heartbeat, and I smile because it sounds steady. Tomorrow will arrive with its errands and its small noises, and I will meet it with these same imperfect hands. They once built a life for others. Now they build one for me, and that, at last, is enough.